Thank you very much, Mary, and thank you very much to the Water Integrity Network and SWA for this invitation. It's great to be here and to have a chance to talk to all of you. So I think I'd like to start with sort of, I guess, yes, as we said, we'll talk about human rights. I suppose that's a good place to start. And when we're looking at water sanitation, I think, often when we look at finance, the area of finance is sort of seen as this standalone area. It becomes a very separate discussion, and it isn't really grounded in the overall reality of what it is that we're trying to do and achieve. And I think that's where I think the human rights framework is particularly important, with its focus of what is it that we are actually really trying to achieve, what people should all be entitled to. And I think so obviously, we have the recognition of the rights to water and sanitation. We have the emphasis that comes particularly on water for personal and domestic users. We have I think, the very important link and understanding of the role that sanitation plays in people's life. I think there's a very strong intersection of all of this with multiple forms of discrimination and inequality. There's a link with all other rights, health is a key one, education, many others. But I think one of the most important things in the human rights framework is actually to look at what the human rights framework requires when we talk about the obligation of states. Is it puts the responsibility on states. And I will say states there deliberately, because we're first and foremost talking obviously about the state where the people are located, but we are also talking about the obligations of other states. And I think that is very strongly built into the human rights framework, particularly in the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, to be talking about obligations of international assistance and cooperation. So these are what I love to call the neglected obligation. It's been deliberately marginalized by the international community for a very long time, and it's not a debate on it. But just in that context, I think we could spend a lot of time on the legal framework, but I don't think that is perhaps the issue that we are most interested in today. It's more for a framing. The key there is the obligation of the state to be actually addressing, built into the human rights framework, is the obligation to address existing inequalities. And I think this is very, very important to I think for most of you working in the sector, you know it better than I do. When we look at anywhere, and especially but in most developing countries, when we look at the issue of water or sanitation, we are starting often from a framework of a lot of historical inequality. So I'm from India, and I mean, you have to just look at the sort of legacies that we have inherited, often with sort of colonial states of where the infrastructure existed, if at all, who had access to that infrastructure at one level, particularly in an urban context. So you often start with unequal access, right? And I must say, I used to work on water many years ago for an international human rights NGO, and it was quite fascinating and disturbing to see in Europe how that played out with certain marginalized communities like the Roma, who otherwise in context where everybody had access to water, they didn't have access to water. And there was a deliberate choice and a policy measure effectively of neglect. But in that context, what we're talking about in the urban context is one, often an unequal access. And of course, again, as many of you are aware, in the rural context, often a more complex reality where there may have been very strong systems in many cases of actually water harvesting or water preservation. But many of these are now threatened by other patterns that have come up in terms of patterns of agriculture, how water and land use is being managed for many people, particularly say indigenous and other communities, but also, and I think for all of us, a big reality of the effect of the climate crisis and the effect that is having in many communities in terms of being able to access existing systems of water. Why is that important as a framing, I think, is because then when we begin to look at the issue of any time we're talking about any kind of financing or institutional arrangements, I think a key inquiry is, is that going to help the state in addressing these inequalities, in ensuring that everyone, no matter who they are, but particularly the most marginalized communities, is able to access water and sanitation? I think that has to be the guiding lens. For me, this is one of the big things that comes out of the human rights framework of, is this something that is going to enable and support that and ensure that access, and also the quality? Of course, I'm just talking about access there, but the big issue is also quality and the conditions which underlie that, which also include obviously participation and accountability. Is the framework that we're looking at going to enable that? Or are we just sort of looking at it from a purely technocratic way of saying, oh, well, there's a need for money. And I think then let's move to the issue of finance. We know at the moment there is a massive financing gap. I mean, that's not a secret. I'm right now sitting in New York, listening this weekend to the SDG Action Summit and the high-level segments. And yes, everyone's acknowledging we have a massive problem with where we are with the SDG agenda. We know that the pandemic has made the situation really bad. But what are we being told as a prescription right now? We're being told as a prescription right now that yes, effectively, if you break down all the flowery language, it comes down to the money is not there in the public sector. That's the first thing we're expected to believe. The money is not there in the public sector. We haven't been able to mobilize the finance from governments, and therefore the only way out is to unlock private capital and finance. That is the current narrative, and you can hear and see that narrative right across in the billions to trillions agenda, in the World Bank's evolution roadmap, which is setting out the direction of the World Bank Group in response to demands for the shareholders of how it's going to go forward. It's even there, I'm sorry to say, when we look at the UN Secretary General's Our Common Agenda and what he's talking about, even going to the summit of the future next year, of again de-risking private, using public finance and blended finance to de-risk private finance. So it's in every domain that we can turn around and see. And I think, again, what I think is useful is to take a step back from this agenda and try and understand, first of all, in concrete terms, what does it mean? So what would financialization actually, which is the sort of shorthand term that we can use, what does it concretely involve? What does it mean, right? So we're looking at a number of things in this sort of rubric of what's being talked about. So first of all, we are talking about lots of fancy terminology, but we're talking about using both public finance, so finance within countries, but also aid and money that countries are receiving from aid, using that public finance to effectively de-risk, as we say, private investment, which means to create conditions to attract private investment, which will include the host state taking on, or through these other investors, taking on many of the risks of that investment to create an enabling environment for that private capital to come in. We're also seeing another trend, which is to make issues like sort of look at certain things to become asset classes for investment. And there is a big trend now of infrastructure, all kinds of infrastructure being seen as a new asset class, but also a very fancy new term, very, very popular within these circles, natural capital. The idea of how do we take nature and see it as something that can actually be treated as the form of, effectively can be invested in and can be effectively commodified in the way that this will work. And then building off this edifice is a lot of securitization. So essentially then looking at turning all of these into various forms of investments that others can invest in. So how would that work classically? For many of you who are in this sector, you will know it, you have seen it. So you basically begin often with a context of, for example, so when we say financialization, I mean, I think I can get the definition. It's essentially basically, it's the growing role of finance. It's where something, particularly say something like water begins to be seen as a financial asset, and where there's actually a much greater role of financial actors in the development of the infrastructure, but a much greater role in impacting the whole chain of what we are involved. But essentially how it often starts is, we know basically, you have something is, for example, water is privatized. That's often a first step for it when for-profit companies take over. And then water can be further financialized. And that means that essentially then whatever's coming out of that becomes a commodity which can be traded. And many examples of that, you can have bonds, you can have futures markets, where we know there's a water futures market, which is something the Special Rapporteur on Water spoke about in his 2021 report. But essentially you're looking at a lot of sort of financial products that come out of this, including outcomes. Outcomes can be, how we're doing on sewage or how we're doing on water can become something that's traded, and then that becomes part of the chain. So you then get into, actually, if you look at the network of actors who are involved in this chain, It's no longer, even for those who've dealt with privatization, that's complex enough. You're starting at one set of companies and then their investors and others. But in this chain of financialization, you're getting more and more into a completely opaque and extremely very diverse set of actors who can be involved, including things like shadow banks and others. Now, we could spend a lot of time on that, but I'm conscious of, Mary, give me some indication of when I'm running out of time, maybe a few minutes before. I think the question is this, I think the key question for us to ask is this a good model? Is this a model that is going to help us actually realize the rights to water and sanitation? And I say that, the reason we ask that question in a far more fundamental term and fundamental way, and I'll obviously give you some of my views on that as to start the discussion on the fact I don't think it is a good model, and for various reasons that flow from it. But in the human rights movement, but also others linked economic justice and others, we have had a tendency not to examine the model itself. You know, the states or companies and others come up with the model, and we tend to come in and then say, okay, this is the model, what safeguards can we build? You know, so we don't actually question, let's say, the model of financing or some of the institutional arrangements. Often our focus becomes on safeguards. You know, can we build in more procedural safeguards? So I spent a lot of my career working on business and human rights and trying to, for example, look at due diligence standards in this area. And I'm not saying they're not useful. I think they are. They have been useful. They're useful for communities and others when we look at to see, you know, what is the responsibilities of the business, etc. But ultimately, I have to say, after many years of work, I'm forced to say, yes, it helps to a certain extent, but it does not fundamentally sometimes address the problems that are inherently built into the model. Yes, we can get a bit more scrutiny, we can get a bit more participation, we can sometimes get a bit more accountability, but we're not addressing the systemic problems. And businesses are very good at evolving the model to get past the safeguards. So we are almost one step behind in all of this. So I think the sort of thing I would sort of say is, I would argue that the current model, financialization, that's being promoted by most international actors, is extremely dangerous. It's effectively, you know, we've seen overwhelming evidence that privatization, particularly privatization of water and sanitation, yes, there are some instances where you could say this, but overwhelmingly we have huge evidence that it has not delivered on the promise that was pushed by multilateral banks for many years. And civil societies had to fight a big action on showing the problems, etc. And the problems are obviously, I mean, with all of this, is inherently built into the model. Again, I would sort of just come back to the model. The model of all of the private actors, I'm afraid, is the private actors, no matter how much we incentivize them and make them, the private actors have to prioritize the interests of their shareholders. That's inbuilt into the logic of companies as we know them right now. There's work to challenge that, and that's a different story. So we are looking at a segment where we're saying, let's make this attractive and profitable. But a lot of what is required is not profitable in and of itself. It requires a lot of investment in infrastructure, in addressing inequalities, that really, it cannot be driven by a profit logic. It has to be driven by the logic of what we see coming from human rights. It is a state obligation. These are public goods, and we require investment, whether or not it is going to be profitable in the end. And that's a sort of fundamental problem that we've seen in many countries in the world. The UK is a great example at the moment of the challenges with water privatization, but there are many, many others. But I think it's also going more fundamentally to the narrative of how do we build accountability and participation in these kinds of contexts? Because again, you're dealing with very, very diffuse actors and what they're trying to do. But more fundamentally, we are also getting caught into a narrative. There's a narrative here of scarcity, as I said, that money does not exist in the public sector. And it's actually taking us away from thinking of other alternatives that can exist. And I'll just briefly go through them, and we can talk about them in the depth. First and foremost, I think the acknowledgement that a lot of countries are being forced into this position because of a very vicious debt and austerity cycle that in itself is being imposed by international actors. And there isn't enough of a focus of saying, well, actually, how should we be addressing that aspect? So freeing up public resources. Tax, which is grossly neglected as a way to raise revenues. There's huge amounts of, I mean, I'm sure everyone is extremely familiar with this and looking at, there's huge amounts of inequality built into the system right now. from the sort of profit sharing methods that exist, the weaknesses in tax rules, the failure to invest. And I think that's one of the other aspects of a lot of privatization projects that has not been examined, which is actually in the end, even if, let's say, the project is not inherently so harmful in terms of the access to water, but where do the profits, where do the revenues from this effectively from public resources end up, and in whose hands is another key dimension. But these are all aspects of things we're not seeing. And then also, I think fundamentally the model of how we engage with the private sector. We have ended up shifting the mode of engagement with the private sector, where it's now like the private sector is almost seen as a more powerful entity that has to be lured to the table. And I would sort of very much say we should be careful not to fall into that trap, because it is a trap. There's a lot of work done, in fact, not just by radical human rights lawyers, but by economists like Mariana Mazzucato, who are questioning this very notion, to say, in fact, for many years, the state set the terms of the private sector engagement. The state can choose the way the private sector engages, can be part of their license to operate. Instead of which, we are stuck in this cycle of actually looking at everything that's going to be done right now to make investments profitable for the private sector, instead of asking, well, actually, how do we treat some of these fundamental public goods and public services, and look at the obligations of all governments to be enabling them. Mary, I think I'm probably up on time, so I'll stop there, but very, very happy to carry on the discussion.
That's a great start. Thanks, Meghna.